I'm going to try keep this as short as I possibly can make it, but what I want to discuss is basically the crime rates that we have in South Africa and what I think are possible solutions and some of the solutions that should be reintroduced into South Africa or maybe also emulated from other countries. One of the most interesting countries when it comes to the solving of the crime problem has been El Salvador. And I think El Salvador is a great case study that most citizens of the country should actually pay attention to, but more importantly, the law enforcement of the country, because what they managed to do with that country and their crime rate is something very phenomenal. But also something that is in question is the death penalty. So Western countries, for the most part, still do have the death penalty, and that in a sense or in a way has been able to also somehow mitigate the amounts of crime that these countries could potentially have. Let's look at a country like the USA, America, for example. The United States of America has a population of over 300 million. So with a population of over 300 million, you would expect that it will be rife with crime, right? And of course there is crime. It doesn't mean that it is with 0% crime. But if you look at the murder rate compared to South Africa and USA, although there are mass shootings and we always hear about their crimes, about people killing each other in their country, but here in South Africa, the rate of which there is violent crime, the rate of which there is murders every single day, it's quite staggering, especially when we look at our population and obviously unofficial population. And unofficial population basically looks like illegal immigrants that are in the country that are unaccounted for. So the crime is really high. Now the question comes in, should we implement the death penalty? And if we implement the death penalty, who gets to get that kind of sentencing? One of my opinions is actually in support to something that I saw Gayton McKenzie saying on Podcast and Chill with McG. And he had mentioned that if you murder someone, you will get arrested and you will be arrested for a very long time. Okay? But if you get out of prison and you kill again, then death penalty comes to you. If you molest a child, if you rape a child, if you are involved in human trafficking, and of especially women and children, you get the death penalty. And in my humble opinion, I think that is actually a right call, because what that will do is not to say it will 100% actually get rid of these types of things happening in the country, but it would lower the numbers. And lowering the numbers is something that we are looking for, because day in, day out, it is feeling a bit by bit, almost every day, it's feeling unsafe to be in South Africa. And especially if you are in Gauteng and even west in Joburg. But when we think about the death penalty with South Africa, it is a touchy subject because of our history with the death penalty in the country. So the death penalty was abolished in 1933 in the United Kingdom here, as I'm reading. But what we could also say about the death penalty in our country is that when it was still there, most of the victims that were hung, or however way the death penalty was actually executed, excuse the pun, in South Africa, was based on a apartheid law system, and a lot of the victims were freedom fighters or activists in the country who were fighting for the liberation of the majority of South Africans, which were black people, colored people, Indians, and so forth, right? So the topic of the death penalty in our country is a bit of a touchy subject. But okay, if we don't look at the death penalty as a part of mitigating the amounts of crimes and the rates of violent crimes that we have in the country, then of course we can look into El Salvador as a case study and a possible way or solution in our country. I'm going to read an article here, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm just going to read how actually they got into solving the crime. So the title of the article is from December 2023. The title is Too Many Soldiers, How Bukele Cracked Down and Succeeded Where Others Failed. Before the administration of El Salvador, President Nayib Bukele, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, no government has succeeded in breaking up the country's vaunted and dangerous street gangs. Dating back to the early 2000s, security forces arrested their members in droves. Politicians sent waves of police officers and soldiers to the streets to dislodge the gangs from poor urban communities where the government had control. They coined a heavy-handed police mano duro, or iron fist in English. But little lasting progress was made. The gangs, bulk of whom were part of the Mara Salvatrucha, which is MS-13, or one of two factions, which is Barrio 18, always found a way to regroup, retaliate, or reorganize their structures to operate under increased pressure. So clearly from the 2000s, they were actually failing to really get rid of the crime that was happening. But in 2022, something changed. So in March 2002, the Bukele administration launched a historic crackdown, implementing a state of emergency that has, for the past 20 months, given his government almost free rein in its war against the gangs. The crackdown has succeeded in arresting a sizable chunk of the gangs' street-level membership and collaborators. It has cut off their communication. It has impeded their ability to manage extortion or drug peddling businesses, their main source of revenue. It disabled their command structures and upended their hierarchies. It has temporarily inhibited their ability to mount a collective organized response. It has, in other words, left them reeling. So, okay, I'm not going to read the whole article because it is quite a long article. I did read it myself, but I will skip to the part where the city's leaked government database said that 39,000 of the 61,000 people who had been incarcerated under the state of emergency had been arrested for unlawful associations. Previous attempts to employ this law ran into legal snags in the courts. Probably because they had some of the police and some of the people in the courts in their pocket. So with Bukele's administration, some of that has also been mitigated. So what it looks like for me is not only did they crack down on the criminals, but they also ensured that on the law enforcement side of things, they ensured that there was less corruption, or if anybody was in the pockets of these gangs, was also arrested and also charged with crimes in the country. And this is what has to happen here in this country. First, before we look at the criminals, we look at the law enforcement system. On top of the law enforcement system, the correctional services. So at the moment, I think we have a good candidate who, well, he's no longer a candidate, but a good minister in correctional services, and Piet Groenewald, right? But then outside of Piet Groenewald, our law enforcement system has to be improved. So the improvement, number one, come with more funding. I think if police officers, traffic officers, investigators, and people in court, or whomever, are paid a bit more than what they are paid, it would be less tempting for them to get in the pockets of criminals. That's number one. That's also my opinion again. Number two, they have to be much more strict to any person in the law enforcement who is found guilty of crime or colluding with criminals, and they have to be punished very harshly. That if they get arrested, they don't just get a mere 5 years or 7 years. They get a very long stint in prison, and they get to feel that the decisions that they took or they made very dire for them, because it will affect them personally and will also affect their family lives. And what that does, in my opinion, is that it will serve as an example to other people coming into law enforcement, because I actually do believe that in our police system there is a lot of good people who want to do their work, but they can't do their work properly because there's so many mitigating factors. The mitigating factors not only being the way in which our law enforcement system is set up, but also because of some of their colleagues who are more on the corrupt side. And then after that, then we look at our own criminals here in the country, because we're 60 or 65 million people population of the country. The law has to be harsh on criminals that are in the country. Very, very harsh. Very, very harsh. No mercy whatsoever. And the correctional services has to actually improve in a sense that it's not just about correction, because we have people who go to prison for small petty crimes and they come back as hardened criminals. So being in jail must be something that they are so afraid of doing that when they do their crimes, maybe they're a bit more careful, or they're a bit less violent, or they just don't get involved in crime whatsoever, because crime actually affects so many things outside of just, let's say, me personally, but the economy of the country gets affected in many ways, because criminals come also in many levels. They come from your petty thief all the way to your fraudsters who can fraud the country into stealing millions or billions from poor people, right? Or even from rich people, doesn't matter. And then after that, we also look at the immigration laws. The immigration laws and also the border gates, they get even more controlled, more funding, so that we can mitigate the amount of illegal foreigners that come into the country, whether they are from within Africa or they are from outside Africa. It gets very harsh and very difficult for you to find yourself in South Africa illegally. And if you find yourself in South Africa legally, it has to be mandatory that every year or every 3 years, maybe every year in the beginning, or even 6 months in the beginning, that you always check in somehow with Home Affairs or whatever authorities that are there, so that you can be vetted. If you have committed any crimes, if you have been accused of any crimes, anything of that sort, and if anything of that sort is found, you are arrested and not deported. Because you see, for example, again with America, if you commit crimes from outside of America, but the crimes that you are committing outside of America actually affect America, you can be extradited to America as long as America has a relationship with the country that you are from. So South Africa needs to have something like that as well. If somebody is committing crimes here and they eventually get found that they are committing crimes and they are on the run and they're being looked for and they choose to go back to their country, South Africa has to have relationships with these countries that we can go get that person and bring them back to the country and punish them. And I think that might help us citizens who are not involved in crimes whatsoever, because crime affects us in many horrible ways, and we need to find a way to deal with this. Lest if that doesn't happen, the people will get more and more angry, and we'll keep on taking the law into our own hands. Because even if we try to protect ourselves, it's not very easy to protect yourself. As a gun owner, for example, you can't just shoot a criminal who is in your yard, in your house, coming in to do a crime. You can't just shoot that person. There has to be steps taken before, things that have to fall in place in order for you to have actually had the right to shoot this person and protecting yourself and your family. So things have to be a bit harsher here in the country. If we don't bring the death penalty back, then we look at case studies such as El Salvador. We also look at how other countries have their immigration laws set up and how it's working for them. And then the law enforcement within the country actually works against criminals and against criminals who are working within official spaces. And yeah, that's my opinion on this. Maybe we'll expand further. It depends on the comments on what other people think. I'll see you in the next one. Let's have a conversation. Salute.